The city was a machine that never slept, and he was a small, quiet part that no one ever noticed. His world was made of pavement and park benches, the cold granite of a low wall that was his usual spot, and the constant, dull roar of traffic that had become like white noise. Every day was the same. He would wake up in his hidden corner, pack his few belongings into a worn and faded backpack, and make his way to the heart of the financial district. Here the buildings reached so high they seemed to scrape the sky, and the people who hurried past were dressed in clothes that cost more than he could even imagine. They walked with purpose, their eyes fixed on screens or staring straight ahead, always in a rush to get to somewhere important. He was the opposite of that. His life was slow, measured in the slow crawl of the sun across the glass and steel towers. He was a man who had learned to become invisible. People's eyes would slide right over him, as if he were a ghost or a piece of street furniture. He didn't mind it most of the time. It was better than the alternative, the stares of pity, or worse, the looks of fear and disgust. So he sat on his wall, watching the river of suits and briefcases flow past. If you had stopped to really look at him, you might have noticed his hands. They were resting on his knees, strong-looking but covered in the grime and calluses of a life lived outdoors. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, those hands would move. His long fingers would twitch and dance, tracing silent, complicated patterns on the fabric of his worn-out pants. It was a nervous habit, but it looked like something more. It looked like memory. Then one Tuesday, something new appeared in the plaza. A team of workers assembled it with care, right in the center of the open space. It was a grand piano, so shiny and black it looked like a pool of dark oil. A sign next to it read, "Play me, I'm yours." It was a public art project, meant to bring a little music and joy to the busy city. At first it was exactly that. Office workers on their lunch break would plunk out a few clumsy notes of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Teenagers would giggle and try to play a pop song. People would take pictures with it, their smiles bright against its glossy finish. It was a novelty, a temporary distraction, but for the man on the wall, the piano was something else entirely. It was a magnet. From the moment it appeared, his eyes were drawn to it. He watched everyone who approached it, his body still but his attention fixed. He didn't just see the people. He seemed to be listening, waiting for something. A strange look would sometimes cross his face when a particularly wrong note was hit. A brief, almost painful wince that was there and gone in a flash. Days turned into a week. He found himself timing his days around the piano. He would arrive earlier, just to watch the morning light reflect off its lid. He would stay later, until the evening crowds thinned out. His mind began to wander to places he had kept locked away for a very long time. The twitching in his fingers became more frequent, more pronounced. He remembered a different life. A life with a roof overhead and warmth. A life filled with sound. Not the noise of the city, but the rich, full sound of a piano. He could almost feel the smooth, cool ivory under his fingertips. He could almost hear the deep resonance of a low C note filling a quiet room. These memories were like ghosts, both comforting and painful. They reminded him of who he used to be. A person so far removed from the man he was, now that it felt like a story about someone else. One afternoon, as the sun was starting to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long, deep shadows across the plaza, something shifted in him. The usual crowd of office workers had gone home. The piano sat alone, silent and majestic. The air was growing cold, and he pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself. He looked at his hands, curled in his lap. They were dirty, the nails chipped. They were the hands of a man who slept rough. But as he stared at them, he saw something else. He saw the hands of a young man, sitting straight-backed on a piano bench, his heart soaring with the music he was creating. A battle raged inside him. One voice, tired and defeated, told him to stay put. "It's not for you," the voice whispered. "You'll make a fool of yourself. They'll just laugh or call the police." But another voice, one he hadn't heard in years, was stronger. It was a pull, a deep, undeniable yearning. It wasn't about proving anything to the people who walked past him every day. It was about proving something to himself. It was about seeing if that part of him, the part that loved music more than anything, was still alive. His heart began to beat hard and fast against his ribs. He looked around. A few people were still milling about, but no one was paying him any mind. He was still invisible. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he slowly slid off the wall. His legs felt weak. He adjusted the strap of his backpack on his shoulder and took a step. Then another. Each step towards the piano felt like a mile. The world seemed to slow down. The sounds of the city faded into a dull hum. All he could see was the piano, growing larger and larger with every step. Finally, he was there. He stood before the magnificent instrument, his reflection warped and blurry in its polished black surface. He could see the faint outline of his own face, weary, lined, and full of a nervous hope. He reached out a trembling hand and let his fingertips gently brush the wood. It was smooth and cool. This was it, the point of no return. He walked around to the front, and with a final glance around the emptying plaza, he sat down on the polished wooden bench. The feel of it was both foreign and deeply, profoundly familiar. He placed his worn backpack carefully on the ground beside him. He was no longer invisible. He was a homeless man sitting at a grand piano, and he was about to play. The polished wood of the piano bench felt strangely solid and real beneath him. It was a simple thing, but for a man who spent his life on hard surfaces and the cold ground, it felt like a throne. He placed his hands on his knees, trying to stop them from shaking. He could feel the eyes. They were like little pinpricks on the back of his neck. A young couple, walking quickly and laughing, suddenly stopped their conversation. They stared at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. He saw the woman nudge the man, and they both slowed their pace, not quite stopping, but not moving on either. A businessman, talking loudly on his phone, paused mid-sentence. He didn't hang up, but he lowered his phone and just watched, his brow furrowed. From the corner of his eye, the man on the bench could see a few others beginning to linger. They were keeping a safe distance, but they were there. He was a spectacle. A homeless man at a grand piano. What was he going to do? Bang on the keys? Make a scene? His heart was a wild drum in his chest. The voice of doubt was screaming at him now. What are you doing? Get up, walk away. This is a mistake. You don't belong here. He looked down at the keyboard. It was a vast landscape of black and white, 88 keys that seemed to stretch out forever. It looked intimidating, like a foreign language he had once known but had long since forgotten. His fingers, resting on his dirty pants, felt clumsy and thick. How could these hands, which spent their days holding a cheap cup for spare change, possibly remember how to do anything beautiful? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the watching people, the towering buildings, the entire city. He focused on his breathing, taking a slow, deep breath in and letting it out even slower. He needed to go somewhere else in his mind. He needed to find a memory, a safe place, and then it came to him. Not a specific piece of music at first, but a feeling. The feeling of being a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting next to his grandmother on an old, scarred piano bench in her living room. The room always smelled of lemon polish and old books. His grandmother's hands, wrinkled and covered in delicate blue veins, would gently place his small, chubby fingers on the correct keys. "Listen," she would whisper, her voice soft and warm. "Just listen to the sound. It's alive." He could almost smell that room now. He could almost feel the warmth of her beside him. The memory was so strong, so vivid, it pushed the fear aside for just a moment. He slowly lifted his hands from his knees. They were still trembling, but he willed them to stop. He held them over the keys, his fingers curved just so, the way he had been taught a lifetime ago. The small crowd of onlookers had grown a little. There were maybe 10 or 12 people now, standing in a loose half-circle. They were silent, waiting. A young woman holding a coffee cup looked almost nervous for him. A man in a delivery uniform had his arms crossed, his face unreadable. They were all expecting something, but he knew it wasn't what he was about to give them. They were waiting for a joke, for a failure. He ignored them. He brought his focus back to the keyboard. He found middle C. It was the anchor, the home base for every pianist. He just rested his right thumb on it, not pressing down, just feeling the cool, smooth surface. He took one last deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool evening air, and then he played a single note. It was not a hard, angry strike. It was not a timid, fearful tap. It was a firm, confident press. The note, a pure C, rang out across the plaza. The sound was clear and full, a beautiful resonant tone that hung in the air, cutting through the distant traffic noise. It seemed to vibrate in the very center of his chest. For a second, everything was still. The note was the only thing that existed. That one note was a key. It unlocked a door in his mind that had been rusted shut for years. The fear, the doubt, the shame, it all melted away, replaced by something else. A feeling of rightness, a feeling of coming home. His hands, which had seemed so clumsy moments before, now knew exactly what to do. His left hand moved to form a rich, complex chord low on the piano. His right hand began to dance. It started with a simple, searching melody, quiet and thoughtful. The music that flowed from the piano was not a happy, cheerful tune. It was something deeper, more complicated. It was a piece by Frédéric Chopin, a nocturne. It was music meant for the night, full of longing, sadness, and a breathtaking, fragile beauty. The change in the atmosphere was instant and electric. The people who were watching him, expecting a stumble, were frozen in place. The young couple's expressions of mild curiosity had vanished, replaced by looks of stunned disbelief. The businessman on the phone slowly, without looking, put his phone in his pocket, his mouth slightly agape. The woman with the coffee cup just stared, her drink forgotten, her other hand coming up to cover her heart. His own world had shrunk to the space between his hands and the keyboard. He wasn't playing the music. He was feeling it. He was pouring every lost dream, every lonely night, every memory of warmth and love, and every bit of the pain of the last 10 years into the keys. His body moved with the phrases of the music, leaning into the loud, powerful sections, pulling back for the soft, whisper-quiet passages. His eyes were closed now. He was not in a city plaza. He was in his grandmother's living room. He was on a stage from his past. He was anywhere but here, and yet he had never been more present in his life. The music swelled, telling a story without words. It was a story of loss, yes, but also of a love that never completely died. It was a story of beauty found in the midst of hardship. The people listening weren't just hearing a song. They were witnessing a soul being laid bare. They were seeing the invisible man become for a few minutes the most visible and real person in the entire city, and they were completely, utterly speechless. The music wasn't loud, but it had a power that seemed to push back the city's noise, creating a quiet bubble in the middle of the bustling plaza. It was a deep, rolling wave of sound, full of emotion that you could almost touch. It didn't sound like a song you'd hear on the radio. This was different. This was the kind of music that spoke of heartbreak and memory, of beautiful things that were lost. The man was lost in it. His eyes were closed and his body moved gently with the rhythm of the piece. He wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. His fingers, which had been so stiff and unsure just minutes before, now moved on their own. They remembered. They danced across the keys with a grace that was shocking to see. The contrast between his rough appearance, the worn coat, the tired face, and the beautiful, sophisticated music he was creating was something nobody could understand. It didn't make sense, and that was what held everyone frozen. The small group of people who had first stopped to watch had now grown. A woman on her way home with groceries had put her heavy bags down on the pavement, her full attention captured. A cyclist had gotten off his bike and was just standing there, helmet in hand. The young couple who had been there from the start were holding hands tightly, as if the music was pulling them closer together. The businessman had taken his phone out again, but this time he wasn't making a call. He was discreetly recording, wanting to capture this impossible moment. But the music reached even further. Across the plaza, the doors to a grand hotel were open. Inside, a fancy charity gala was happening. The room was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and the soft chatter of people in elegant clothes. They were all there to support a good cause, but in that moment, they were also there to see and be seen. Then a few notes of the piano music drifted in through the open doors. At first, it was just a whisper underneath the party noise. A woman in a deep blue dress, holding a glass of champagne, tilted her head. "Listen," she said softly to the man next to her. He stopped talking and listened. The beautiful, sorrowful melody was now clearer, cutting through the buzz of the party. One by one, conversations died down. The laughter faded. The music was a magnet, pulling the attention of the entire room. A man who was clearly the host of the event, a respected community leader, walked slowly towards the large glass windows that looked out onto the plaza. Others followed until a crowd of the city's most wealthy and influential people were gathered at the glass, looking out at the source of the music. What they saw was a scene they could not process. They saw a man who, by all appearances, had nothing. A man who, on any other day, they might have walked past without a second thought or crossed the street to avoid. And he was creating the most profoundly beautiful sound many of them had ever heard. There were no sneers, no jokes, no condescending smiles. The music was too honest, too raw for that. It stripped away all the layers of money and status. A well-known art gallery owner, a woman who was used to judging the value of things, felt her eyes well up with tears. She wasn't sure why. A tough-looking financier, a man who made million-dollar decisions before lunch, found his throat getting tight. The music was speaking a language that was deeper than words, a language of feeling that every single person in that room understood. Inside his bubble of sound, the man at the piano was traveling through time. The music was a bridge to his old life. He wasn't just playing Chopin. He was remembering the small, sunlit room where he first learned this piece. He was remembering the feeling of pride when he finally mastered the difficult middle section. He was remembering the face of his teacher, a stern but kind old man who had told him, "Music is not in the fingers, it is in the heart. Play it with your heart or don't play it at all." He was playing it with his heart now. He was pouring every bit of his story into the piano. The joy of his early years, the crushing pain of his accident, the long, slow descent into darkness, and the tiny, stubborn spark of hope that had never completely gone out. It was all there in the rise and fall of the melody. His shoulders shook slightly as he played a particularly emotional passage. It was a release, a healing. For the first time in a very long time, he was not hiding. He was not pretending to be invisible. He was offering his true self to the world, and the world, for these few minutes, was listening in stunned silence. Back inside the gala, the host of the event turned to the people around him. His usual confident, smiling face was gone, replaced by a look of deep thought and emotion. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head slowly, as if to say, "I have no words." Nobody else did either. The speechlessness wasn't about shock anymore. It was about respect. It was about the humbling realization that talent, beauty, and a deep human soul can be found in the most unexpected of places, often in those we have been trained to ignore. The man at the piano, in his brokenness, was giving them a gift far more valuable than any amount of money, and they all knew it. The final notes of the piece were the softest of all. They weren't played so much as they were breathed onto the keys. A gentle sigh that faded into the evening air until there was only silence. For a long moment, nothing moved. The man kept his head bowed, his hands resting lightly on the keys now, as if saying a quiet goodbye to an old friend. The spell was broken, but the feeling it created hung over the plaza, thick and real. Then a single, sharp sound cut through the quiet. It was the sound of one person clapping. It came from the woman in the blue dress, who was still standing at the glass window of the gala. Her face was wet with tears she hadn't even felt coming. Her clap was slow and deliberate, a sound of deep respect, not just entertainment. It was like a spark hitting dry wood. Another person joined in, then another. The applause spread from the wealthy crowd inside the hotel, through the glass, and out into the plaza where the ordinary people stood. The businessman, the couple, the cyclist, the woman with her groceries, they all began to clap. It wasn't wild, cheering applause. It was something better. It was heartfelt, warm, and sustained. It was a wave of gratitude washing over him. The sound jolted the man back to the present. He slowly lifted his head and opened his eyes, looking around as if waking from a deep dream. The world came back into focus, the buildings, the lights, the people. So many people. And they were all looking at him, their hands coming together in a roaring sound that echoed between the skyscrapers. A look of confusion crossed his face, followed by a flicker of something like fear. He wasn't used to being seen. He quickly looked down, pulling his hands back from the keyboard and shoving them into the pockets of his coat. as if to hide the very things that had created the magic. He moved to stand up, to slip away back into the shadows where he belonged, but he was too slow. The crowd from the gala began to spill out of the hotel doors, flowing into the plaza. They weren't running, but their movement was determined. They surrounded the piano in a loose circle, not threateningly, but with a sense of awe and curiosity. He was trapped, but not by walls. He was trapped by their attention. A young man, looking earnest and holding a small professional camera, stepped forward. He wasn't a guest at the gala. He was a local reporter who had been covering the event. "Sir?" the reporter said, his voice gentle but clear. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to play like that?" The man on the bench shrank back slightly. He shook his head, mumbling something that was too low for anyone to hear. He just wanted to leave. But the reporter persisted, not with aggression, but with genuine wonder. "Please," he said. "People need to hear this. They need to know your story. How did you end up here?" The crowd was silent again, waiting. You could have heard a pin drop. The man looked at the sea of faces. He saw no mockery there. He saw confusion, yes, but he also saw kindness. He saw empathy. He took a deep, shaky breath. The wall he had built around himself for so long began to crack. He spoke, his voice rough from lack of use, but clear enough for those in the front to hear. "It was a long time ago," he started, his eyes fixed on the piano's black lid, seeing not his reflection, but the past. I was a student. At the music conservatory." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This confirmed their suspicions, but hearing it was still a shock. He went on, the words coming slowly at first, then a little easier, as if a faucet had been turned on after years of being shut off. He talked about his life as a young man, full of music and promise. He was a rising star, a pianist with a bright future. His teachers had high hopes for him. He loved the piano more than anything in the world. Then he told them about the rain. A night of heavy rain, a slick road. He was in a car with friends, coming back from a concert. He described the blinding headlights of the other vehicle, the screech of tires, the terrible crushing sound of metal. His voice grew even quieter. "My hand," he said, holding up his right hand for everyone to see. It looked strong, but if you looked closely, you could see a slight, unnatural curve to two of the fingers, old scars whitened against his skin. It was broken in many places. The doctors did their best, but it was never the same. He explained that the dream of being a concert pianist died that night. The delicate coordination, the strength, the speed required, it was gone. The depression that followed was a deep, dark hole he couldn't climb out of. He lost his scholarship. He lost his purpose. The medical bills piled up, and with no way to pay them, he lost his apartment too. "The music." "It was still inside me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I couldn't let it out. It was too painful. It was a reminder of everything I had lost. So I just stopped. I stopped playing. I stopped trying." For 10 years, he had been walking through life, a ghost of his former self. The piano in the plaza had called to that forgotten part of him. It was the first time he had played in a decade. He had been terrified, but he had to know if the music was still there. By the time he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the immediate crowd. The wealthy socialite was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The tough financier was blinking hard, looking up at the sky. The story was not one of laziness or poor choices. It was a story of tragedy, of a life derailed by a single unlucky moment. It was a story that could happen to anyone. The man they had all seen as other was suddenly just a man who had suffered, who had fallen, but who still had something priceless and beautiful inside him. The applause that had greeted his performance was nothing compared to the profound, respectful silence that now greeted his truth. The silence after he finished speaking was heavy with emotion. It was a different kind of quiet than before. The first silence was about shock, about the beauty of the music. This silence was about understanding. People were processing his story. They were looking at him not as a homeless man or as a brilliant pianist, but simply as a human being who had been through a terrible struggle. You could see it in their eyes. The pity was gone, replaced by a deep, shared sadness and a new kind of respect. He shifted uncomfortably on the piano bench. The attention was still overwhelming. He had shared his deepest pain with a crowd of strangers, and now he felt exposed and vulnerable. He looked towards the ground, searching for an escape route. His instinct was to grab his backpack and disappear into the night, to go back to being invisible. It was safer that way. But the world had other plans. The crowd parted slightly as a woman stepped forward. She was older, with a kind face and sharp, intelligent eyes. She was dressed elegantly, but her expression was warm and without any judgment. "Please," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Don't run off. My name is not important, but what I do is. I run a music therapy program at the city hospital. We work with people who have physical injuries, just like your hand. We have specialists who help musicians adapt, who find new ways to play." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I would be honored if you would come and meet with our team. There might be ways to bring the music back more fully, to help you play with less pain." The man looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. This was not what he had expected. He expected curiosity, maybe some loose change, but not this, not a real offer of help. Before he could even form a response, a man in a well-tailored suit moved next to the woman. He had the confident air of someone used to making big decisions. "I was at the gala inside," the man said, gesturing towards the hotel. "I own a small chain of restaurants in the city. We always have a piano in the lounge. What you played tonight, that's the kind of feeling people remember. It's the kind of feeling that makes an evening special. I'm not offering you pity. I'm offering you a job. A real one. A few nights a week, playing what you love. A steady paycheck, and a roof over your head." The man on the bench felt the world start to spin. A job? Playing piano? It was the dream he had buried a decade ago. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Then a third person, a younger man with a friendly face, joined the circle. "I'm a physical therapist," he said simply. "I specialize in repetitive strain injuries, especially for musicians. I heard what you said about your hand. I work with the clinic the woman mentioned. I can help you. I volunteer my time there. Let me help you get the strength back." The floodgates were open. Another person, a local business owner, offered him a small apartment above one of his shops at a rent he could afford. "It's been empty for a while," the man said with a shrug. "It needs a tenant. It would be good to have someone in there." The offers weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, sincere, and practical. They weren't just about giving him money. They were about giving him back his dignity, his purpose, and his music. They were a ladder being built right in front of him, a way out of the hole he had been in for so long. Tears, which he had been fighting back since he started playing, now streamed freely down his face. They weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable relief. For 10 years, the world had been a cold, hard place that had taken everything from him. In the span of a single hour, it had given it all back and more. He looked from one kind face to another. The gallery owner, the restaurateur, the therapist, the reporter. These were people from a world he thought was closed to him forever. And they were looking at him not as a problem, but as a person with a gift worth saving. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. He wiped his eyes with the back of his rough sleeve. "Thank you. Thank you." The woman from the music therapy program smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything. You already said everything you needed to with your music. Now, let us help with the rest." He nodded slowly, a real, genuine smile breaking through the tears and the grime on his face. It was a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. He bent down and picked up his old, worn backpack. It felt lighter than it had in a long, long time. He wasn't just carrying his few belongings anymore. He was carrying a new beginning. As he stood up, the crowd, which had been holding its breath, erupted into applause once more. This time it was different. It was a cheer, a celebration. They weren't just applauding the performance. They were applauding the man and the hope that his story represented. He looked out at the sea of smiling, tearful faces, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt for a fleeting moment like he was home. The story of the pianist in the plaza did not end with that night. It was only the beginning. The video the reporter took was shown on the local news. It wasn't just a clip of a man playing piano. It was the whole story, the stunning music, the shocked crowd, and his quiet, heartbreaking explanation. It was a story that touched a deep nerve in the city. People shared it online, not because it was a strange curiosity, but because it was a story about a human being. It was about loss, but it was also about the hidden beauty that exists in people we often overlook. For the man, life began to change in slow, steady steps. It was not a magical overnight fix. The first few days were a blur of new sensations. The physical therapist was true to his word. The man went to the clinic, and for the first time in a decade, someone was looking at his injured hand not as a tragedy, but as a puzzle to be solved. The therapist showed him gentle exercises. They were small, simple movements, but they were a start. It was about rebuilding the connection between his mind and his muscles, about learning to make music without the sharp, familiar pain. The restaurant owner was also a man of his word. He showed the pianist the small apartment above his shop. It was simple, just one room with a small kitchen and a bathroom, but to the man it was a palace. It had a door that locked. It had a window that looked out over a quiet street. It had a bed. The first night he spent there, he lay awake for a long time just listening to the silence. It was a clean, safe silence, so different from the frightening noises of the street. He slept for 12 hours straight, a deep, dreamless sleep he hadn't known in years. A week after the night in the plaza, he started his job at the restaurant. He was nervous. This was different from playing for strangers outside. This was a real job with expectations. He wore a clean shirt given to him by the owner. He sat at the beautiful piano in the corner of the lounge. The first few notes were shaky. He could feel the eyes of the diners on him. But then, he closed his eyes, just for a second, and remembered the feeling of the plaza. He remembered that the music was inside him and it was his to share. He began to play. It was a different piece this time, something a little softer, a little more peaceful. He played for an hour, and when he finished, the people in the restaurant applauded softly. It wasn't the roaring applause of the crowd, but it was just as meaningful. It was respect. He was not a spectacle anymore. He was the restaurant's pianist. His life found a new rhythm. Mornings were for therapy and exercises. Afternoons were for resting and remembering old pieces of music, his fingers slowly regaining their confidence. Evenings were for work at the restaurant. The paycheck he earned was his. He had earned it with his own two hands. He could buy his own food, his own clothes. He was becoming a part of the world again. He still walked through the same city, but he saw it from a different angle. He was no longer looking up from the bottom. He was walking as an equal. People who had seen the news story would sometimes recognize him and give him a small, respectful nod. He was no longer invisible. One afternoon, he was walking through the financial district on his way to the clinic. He passed the plaza where it had all happened. The grand piano was still there. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, was sitting at it, carefully picking out a simple tune. Her mother stood beside her, smiling proudly. He stopped and watched for a moment, a faint smile on his face. He didn't feel sadness or regret looking at the piano. He felt a strange sense of peace. That piano had been a door, and he had been brave enough to walk through it. His story became a quiet legend in the city. It was a reminder that everyone has a story, that the man sleeping on a park bench might have once been a teacher or a soldier or a musician. It reminded people to look twice, to see the person behind the circumstance. It wasn't about giving handouts. It was about giving chances. The people who helped him that night didn't solve all his problems for him. They gave him the tools, a job, a home, medical care, and he did the hard work of rebuilding his life himself. He never became a world-famous concert pianist. That wasn't the point of his story. He found something better. He found a life of purpose and dignity. He continued to play at the restaurant, bringing moments of beauty into the lives of others. He continued his therapy not just for his hand, but for his soul. The music was no longer a painful reminder of what he had lost. It had become a joyful celebration of what he had found again. It was the sound of a second chance, a melody that started with a single lonely note in a crowded plaza and grew into a whole beautiful song.